My darlings, let me take you back to a time when I was just a little girl, long before you were born, long before I had even dreamed of becoming a mother or a grandmother. My name was Evelyn Grace Miller, and I grew up in a small town in Indiana, where life was simple, where the days were long, and where a child could still believe the world was gentle. My earliest memories were happy ones. I remember running barefoot across fields of tall grass with my little brother, Daniel, chasing fireflies on summer nights until Mama called us back inside. The air smelled of sweet corn and hay, and our laughter carried across the open fields like music. Daddy, Henry Miller, worked long shifts at the paper mill, but no matter how tired he was, he always had time for us. He'd lift me high onto his shoulders, his strong hands steady, and say, "Evelyn, you'll see the whole world one day. You're meant for more than this little town." Those words lived in me. Daddy believed in me. And when he looked at me, I felt safe, I felt seen. I felt loved. But life, my darlings, has a way of turning suddenly, without warning. When I was 11 years old, Daddy never came home from the mill. There had been an accident. A machine jammed, they said. He tried to fix it, and it cost him his life. I'll never forget the knock on the door that evening, or the look in Mama's eyes when the foreman gave her the news. It was as if the light in our home dimmed forever. Mama, Margaret, was strong. Stronger than I ever knew at the time. But I saw her shoulders bow under the weight of it all. She took on double shifts at the diner, serving coffee and pie to truck drivers and farmers. Her smile practiced, her hands trembling only when she thought no one was watching. Daniel was too little to understand the depth of it. He cried sometimes, asking when Daddy was coming back, and Mama would just pull him into her arms and whisper, "He's with the angels now." But I understood. I was old enough to see how the world can take from you without asking. Old enough to know that life was about to get harder. And it did. Mama worked from sunrise until after dark most days, and I tried my best to help at home. I cooked simple meals. I washed the laundry on the old washboard. I minded Daniel. We got by, though never easily. Nights were the hardest. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to Mama cry softly in her room. I wanted so badly to make her smile again. But what could a child do? Then, when I was 13, everything changed again. Mama came home one evening with a man. His name was Charles Whitaker. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with polished boots, and a voice that carried confidence. To the townsfolk, Charles seemed respectable. He worked part-time as a mechanic, knew how to shake a hand firmly, and always had a slick smile ready. People said Mama was lucky to have found someone so soon after losing her husband. They said it would be good for us children to have a man in the house again. At first, I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe Charles could fill the hole Daddy had left behind. But my heart knew better, even on that first night when he stepped into our kitchen. There was a coldness in his eyes. He looked at me not with kindness, not with warmth, but with calculation, as if he was sizing me up, measuring what use he could make of me. Still, Mama seemed happy. And after all the sorrow she had carried, I didn't want to take that from her. I bit my tongue, swallowed my unease, and tried to believe things might turn out all right. But the day Mama married Charles, my life shifted into a shadow I could never have imagined. Charles was no father to me. He demanded I call him that, but he gave nothing of what a father should. To him I was nothing more than free labor. At first it was small things. Scrubbing the floors again and again until my knuckles ached, washing dishes until my hands were red and raw. But it grew quickly. He woke me before dawn to chop wood in the cold, shovel snow, until my back screamed, clean out the barn alone while Daniel was allowed to stay warm inside. When Mama was home, Charles pretended to be stern but fair. He called me lazy in front of her, told her I needed discipline, that he was teaching me responsibility. Mama, exhausted and desperate to keep her new marriage steady, stayed silent. Maybe she didn't see the bruises. Maybe she didn't want to see. But I felt alone, utterly alone in that house. I remember one evening vividly. I was 14. Mama was at her late shift, and Charles called me into the kitchen. He pointed at a single speck of dust on the shelf and demanded I clean it again. I had already scrubbed the house from top to bottom that day, my body aching, but I did as he said. When I turned back, he looked at me with disgust. "Useless girl," he spat, and then his hand cracked across my face. I stumbled, my cheek burning, my pride crumbling. "You'll never be anything," he sneered. Those words sank into me like poison. They echoed in my head for years, haunting me even in sleep. But somewhere deep inside, a small voice resisted, a whisper that said, "Don't believe him. Hold on. Survive." At night, I would lie awake in my narrow bed, listening to the winter wind whistle through the cracks in the walls. I would clutch the quilt Mama had sewn long ago, the last piece of warmth from my old life, and I would pray for strength, pray for escape, pray that somehow, someday, I could find my way back to the light. That, my darlings, was the beginning of the darkest chapter of my youth. I didn't know then how long the shadow would last, or how many tears I would cry before it lifted. But even in that darkness, I carried Daddy's words inside me. "You'll see the whole world one day. You're meant for more." And those words, more than anything, became the candle I clung to in the storm. My darlings, when Charles Whitaker married my mother, I hoped, oh, how I hoped, that life would get easier. Mama had worked herself nearly to the bone for years, and I thought maybe, just maybe, this man would take some of the burden from her shoulders. I wanted to believe he could be the protector we had lost when Daddy died. But hope, my sweet ones, can sometimes be a cruel trick. At first, Charles was careful. Around Mama, he spoke softly, even brought flowers to the house once or twice. In church on Sundays, he shook hands, bowed his head during prayer, and smiled that slick smile of his. People admired him. They told Mama she'd done well, told me I should be grateful. But behind closed doors, the mask slipped. It began with chores. "Evelyn!" he barked one morning before the sun had risen. "Get out of bed. Wood doesn't chop itself." I rubbed the sleep from my eyes, shivering as the icy air hit my skin. But I did as he said. I lifted the axe, my arms straining with every swing, the cold biting at my fingers. When I stumbled from exhaustion, he grabbed the handle from me and said, "Pathetic. Even your little brother could do better." Daniel, of course, was never asked. Charles treated him differently, spared him from the worst of it. And though I loved my brother dearly, it hurt me to see that Charles singled me out. I was the target, always me. The punishments grew harsher. If the dishes weren't spotless, he'd yank me by the arm so hard I thought it would snap. If I missed a spot while sweeping, he'd slam the broom against the floor beside me, making me flinch. Sometimes when Mama wasn't home, he used his belt. The first time I was too stunned to cry. The leather lashed across my back, sharp and hot, and when I gasped, he snarled, "You think life's hard now? Keep acting lazy and see what happens." I learned quickly that tears only fueled his anger, so I held them in, swallowing sobs until my chest ached. At night, when the house was quiet, I buried my face into my pillow and wept silently, praying Mama wouldn't hear. But she knew. She had to know. Sometimes she would glance at the bruises on my arms, her lips trembling, and then she'd look away. I wanted her to fight for me. I wanted her to stand between me and him, to tell him enough was enough. But she never did. Perhaps she was afraid. Perhaps she thought she couldn't survive without him. Or maybe, just maybe, she believed the lies he told her. That he was teaching me discipline. Those were lonely years, the kind of loneliness that eats at your soul. I longed for Daddy's voice, for his steady hand on my shoulder, for the warmth in his eyes. I whispered his words to myself over and over. "You'll see the whole world one day. You're meant for more." They were the only thing that kept me from believing Charles's cruel taunts. School should have been my refuge. But even there, his shadow followed me. I was so tired from the endless work that I often nodded off in class. Teachers scolded me for not paying attention. Some kids laughed at my worn-out dresses, at my hands cracked from scrubbing floors. I wanted to tell them everything, to shout the truth, that I was fighting to survive each day, but instead I stayed quiet. I carried my burden alone. There was one place I found comfort, the library. It was a small one, tucked behind the church, with rows of books that smelled of dust and ink. I would slip in whenever I could, my heart pounding with the fear that Charles would catch me. In those pages, I traveled far beyond Indiana. I saw the streets of Paris, the mountains of Colorado, the oceans I'd never touched. For a little while, the walls of that suffocating house melted away, and I could breathe. But the peace never lasted long. Charles always found new ways to remind me that my life belonged to him. Once after a long day at the diner, Mama brought home a slice of pie. Just one. She set it on the table, smiling softly at me, and whispered, "Evelyn, this is for you." But before I could take a bite, Charles snatched it away. "She doesn't deserve it," he growled, and shoved the plate toward Daniel instead. I didn't begrudge my brother. I loved him. But in that moment, I felt invisible. Invisible. And yet, still burning inside, every cruel word, every slap, every chore meant to break me. It all pressed down on me like heavy chains. But in the quiet corners of my soul, I held on to something else. A tiny ember of defiance. A whisper that said, "This will not be forever." Even as I scrubbed floors until my knees bled, even as his belt left its marks across my skin, I told myself, survive. Just survive. And so, my dears, my life began in that house of shadows. I did not yet know how long I would remain under Charles's thumb, or how deeply the scars would cut. But I knew this much. The storm was only growing, and I would need every ounce of strength inside me to endure what was coming. The more the years dragged on, the more I learned how to hide my pain, how to keep my head down when Charles was near. But inside, that little ember of defiance kept glowing. Some nights I would sit by the window when the house was asleep, staring at the dark fields beyond, and imagine what freedom must feel like. A place where no one shouted my name in anger. A place where I could laugh without fear. Books became my secret escape. Whenever I could slip away to the little library, I lost myself in stories. I read about women who crossed oceans, who built lives out of nothing, who endured worse than I could imagine, and still rose stronger. Those pages were lifelines, reminding me that the world was bigger than Charles Whittaker's shadow. There was a woman at the diner where Mama worked, Miss Helen. She had silver hair pulled tight in a bun, and a laugh that could fill a room. Sometimes, when I helped Mama wipe down tables after hours, Miss Helen would press a cookie into my hand and say, "Don't let anyone tell you who you are, honey. Only you get to decide that." I clung to those words like scripture. But Charles, he seemed to sense the flicker of hope inside me, and it made him meaner. He piled more chores on my shoulders. He found fault in everything. "Your stitches are crooked. Your cooking's bland. You'll never be good for anything but work." Each insult was meant to crush me, but instead they stacked up inside, brick by brick, building a wall of quiet determination. One day, when I was 16, something happened that shifted everything. I was carrying a heavy bucket of water from the well when Charles caught sight of me. He sneered, "Clumsy girl, you're gonna spill it." Sure enough, my foot slipped on the step, and water sloshed over the rim. Before I could steady myself, he struck me hard across the back. The bucket crashed to the ground, soaking my shoes. He raised his hand again, but then Daniel stepped forward. My little brother, who had always stayed quiet, suddenly shouted, "Stop! Leave her alone." The room went silent. My heart hammered in my chest. Charles turned on him, eyes blazing, and for a moment I thought he would hit Daniel too. But instead he lowered his hand and muttered, "Both of you. Useless." Then he stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. I rushed to Daniel, pulling him into my arms. He was trembling. "Why'd you do that?" I whispered. "Because I couldn't watch any more," he said, tears streaking his cheeks. "You don't deserve it. None of it." That moment lit something in me brighter than all the stars I'd stared at from my window. For the first time, I realized I wasn't as alone as I thought. My brother saw me. He believed me. And if even one person could see the truth, maybe the world wasn't blind. From that day forward, I started to change. Slowly, quietly, but surely. I stopped shrinking when Charles barked orders. I still obeyed. What choice did I have? But I no longer carried his words like gospel. When he called me worthless, I reminded myself of Miss Helen's laughter, of Daniel's bravery, of the heroines in my books. I told myself, no, I am more than this. And then came the day I decided I would leave. I didn't know how, I didn't know when. But I began saving little scraps of money whenever I could. Coins left behind at the diner, pennies found on the ground. I hid them in a jar beneath a loose floorboard in my room. Each coin was a promise to myself. Each one whispered, "Closer, closer to freedom." The more I planned, the lighter my steps became. Charles still tried to break me, but he no longer owned my spirit. I started humming when I worked, softly at first, then louder. He would sneer and say, "What are you so happy about?" I'd lower my head, but inside I was smiling, because I knew something he didn't. I knew his reign over me was not forever. I can't tell you how many nights I lay awake imagining it, stepping out that door, the cool night air on my face, walking away without ever looking back. I dreamed of a place where I could write my own story, where no one could ever again raise a hand or a cruel word against me. And one fateful night, that chance finally came. The more the years dragged on, the more I learned how to hide my pain, how to keep my head down when Charles was near. But inside, that little ember of defiance kept glowing. Some nights I would sit by the window when the house was asleep, staring at the dark fields beyond, and imagine what freedom must feel like. A place where no one shouted my name in anger. A place where I could laugh without fear. Books became my secret escape. Whenever I could slip away to the little library, I lost myself in stories. I read about women who crossed oceans, who built lives out of nothing, who endured worse than I could imagine, and still rose stronger. Those pages were lifelines, reminding me that the world was bigger than Charles Whittaker's shadow. There was a woman at the diner where Mama worked, Miss Helen. She had silver hair pulled tight in a bun, and a laugh that could fill a room. Sometimes when I helped Mama wipe down tables after hours, Miss Helen would press a cookie into my hand and say, "Don't let anyone tell you who you are, honey. Only you get to decide that." I clung to those words like scripture. But Charles, he seemed to sense the flicker of hope inside me, and it made him meaner. He piled more chores on my shoulders. He found fault in everything. "Your stitches are crooked. Your cooking's bland. You'll never be good for anything but work." Each insult was meant to crush me, but instead they stacked up inside, brick by brick, building a wall of quiet determination. One day, when I was 16, something happened that shifted everything. I was carrying a heavy bucket of water from the well when Charles caught sight of me. He sneered, "Clumsy girl, you're gonna spill it." Sure enough, my foot slipped on the step, and water sloshed over the rim. Before I could steady myself, he struck me hard across the back. The bucket crashed to the ground, soaking my shoes. He raised his hand again, but then Daniel stepped forward. My little brother, who had always stayed quiet, suddenly shouted, "Stop! Leave her alone!" The room went silent. My heart hammered in my chest. Charles turned on him, eyes blazing, and for a moment I thought he would hit Daniel too. But instead he lowered his hand and muttered, "Both of you. Useless." Then he stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. I rushed to Daniel, pulling him into my arms. He was trembling. "Why'd you do that?" I whispered. Because I couldn't watch anymore. He said, tears streaking his cheeks. You don't deserve it. None of it. That moment lit something in me brighter than all the stars I'd stared at from my window. For the first time, I realized I wasn't as alone as I thought. My brother saw me. He believed me. And if even one person could see the truth, maybe the world wasn't blind. From that day forward, I started to change. Slowly, quietly, but surely. I stopped shrinking when Charles barked orders. I still obeyed. What choice did I have? But I no longer carried his words like gospel. When he called me worthless, I reminded myself of Miss Helen's laughter, of Daniel's bravery, of the heroines in my books. I told myself, no, I am more than this. And then came the day I decided I would leave. I didn't know how. I didn't know when. But I began saving little scraps of money whenever I could. Coins left behind at the diner, pennies found on the ground. I hid them in a jar beneath a loose floorboard in my room. Each coin was a promise to myself. Each one whispered, closer, closer to freedom. The more I planned, the lighter my steps became. Charles still tried to break me, but he no longer owned my spirit. I started humming when I worked, softly at first, then louder. He would sneer and say, "What are you so happy about?" I'd lower my head, but inside I was smiling, because I knew something he didn't. I knew his reign over me was not forever. I can't tell you how many nights I lay awake imagining it, stepping out that door, the cool night air on my face, walking away without ever looking back. I dreamed of a place where I could write my own story, where no one could ever again raise a hand or a cruel word against me. And one fateful night, that chance finally came. The night I left is burned into my memory, as clear as the scars on my back. It was late autumn, the wind sharp, the trees stripped bare. Mama was working a late shift, and Charles had gone into town, muttering something about cards and whiskey. I knew I had only a few hours, and if I didn't take them, I might never get another chance. I had been planning for months. My little jar of coins was nearly full, though it wasn't much. Just enough for a bus ticket and maybe a loaf of bread. I had hidden an old satchel under my bed, packed with the few things I could call my own. A change of clothes, a comb, a worn copy of Little Women I'd borrowed from the library, and never returned. That book had been my anchor, and I couldn't bear to leave it behind. My heart pounded so loudly, I feared it would wake Daniel, who was asleep in the room across the hall. I crept to his doorway, watching the rise and fall of his chest in the dim light. He was still so small, though his courage had already proven bigger than any man's. I wanted to shake him awake, to whisper, "Come with me." But I knew if I took him, Charles would hunt us both down, and Daniel would suffer for my choice. So instead, I slipped inside and knelt by his bed. I brushed a curl from his forehead and whispered, "One day, I'll come back for you. I promise." My voice cracked, but he stirred only slightly, murmuring something in his sleep. I kissed his cheek and let my tears fall silently onto his pillow. Then I rose, grabbed my satchel, and crept down the stairs. Each creak of the wood felt like thunder, each shadow like Charles's figure waiting to pounce. But somehow, I made it to the door. My fingers trembled as I turned the knob, and when the cold night air hit my face, I felt something I hadn't in years. Hope. I ran. I didn't look back. My feet carried me down the dirt road, past the fields that had trapped me, past the fences that had hemmed me in. I ran until my lungs burned, until the house was no more than a speck in the distance. Only then did I stop, clutching my satchel to my chest, gasping for air, tears streaming down my face. At the edge of town, I found the little bus station, its single lamp casting a weak glow on the cracked pavement. The ticket clerk looked at me with suspicion. Just a skinny teenage girl, disheveled, clutching a bag like it was life itself. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Anywhere but here," I whispered. He raised an eyebrow, but when I pushed my handful of coins across the counter, he sighed and handed me a ticket. "Chicago," he said. Bus leaves in 10 minutes. Chicago. I had never even dreamed of such a big city. But in that moment, it felt like salvation. When the bus pulled up, I climbed aboard and sank into a seat by the window. As the engine rumbled to life, I pressed my forehead to the glass, watching the familiar streets roll past. My chest ached with the weight of leaving Mama and Daniel behind. But I told myself over and over, this is the only way. This is how I survive. The bus roared into the night, carrying me farther from the life I knew, closer to the unknown. Fear clawed at me. But beneath it pulsed something stronger. Freedom. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to breathe. When the bus finally pulled into Chicago, the sun was just beginning to rise. The sky glowed pale pink, and the city was waking up, bustling in a way I had never seen before. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass of the window, wide-eyed at the tall buildings, the endless streets, the crowds of people moving as if they all had somewhere important to be. I stepped off the bus, clutching my satchel, the city air thick with smoke, the sound of car horns echoing in my ears. I felt like a speck of dust swallowed in a storm. I didn't know a soul here. I had no plan, no family waiting for me, no place to stay. Just a girl with nothing but a few coins left in her pocket, and a heart desperate to start over. The bus station was noisy and smelled of coffee and grease. I sat on a hard bench, hugging my bag close. And for a moment, the fear nearly swallowed me whole. What if Charles came looking? What if I couldn't make it on my own? What if I had traded one misery for another? But then I remembered his face that night, the hatred in his eyes, the way he'd tried to break me. I lifted my chin and whispered to myself, "You made it out. Don't go back." The first day was the hardest. I walked the streets until my feet blistered, searching for anything. A sign, a chance, a scrap of kindness. The city was overwhelming. Men in suits brushed past me without a glance. Women hurried with bags on their arms. And every corner seemed louder, dirtier, colder. I had never felt so invisible. By evening, my stomach ached with hunger. I wandered back to the bus station, too afraid to stray farther. I curled up on the bench with my satchel as a pillow and tried to sleep. The sound of footsteps and voices kept jolting me awake. Every creak of the door made me think Charles had found me. The second morning, I gathered my courage and asked at a diner if they needed help. The man behind the counter looked me up and down. "You're too young," he said. "Come back when you've got papers." I didn't have papers. I barely had proof I existed outside of that house. But I didn't give up. I went from one shop to the next, swallowing the sting of rejection again and again. Some laughed at me. Some shook their heads before I even finished asking. By the end of the day, I was exhausted, hopeless, and ready to cry right there on the sidewalk. That's when I met Mrs. Carter. She was a stout woman with kind eyes, carrying a basket of bread from the bakery. She stopped when she saw me slumped on the curb. "You lost, sweetheart?" she asked. I wanted to be strong, but the tears came anyway. I just need work," I stammered. "Anything, please." She studied me for a moment, then set her basket down. "My brother owns a little diner on the south side. He always needs someone to wash dishes. It's not much, but it's honest work. Come with me." I couldn't believe it. For the first time in days, a hand was reaching toward me instead of pushing me down. I followed her, clutching my satchel, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. The diner was small, the kind of place where the smell of bacon and coffee clung to your clothes. Mrs. Carter's brother, a gruff man with a bald head, eyed me suspiciously but finally nodded. "Fine. Wash the dishes, don't steal, and maybe I'll keep you." And just like that, I had my first job. It wasn't glamorous. My hands lived in soapy water. My back ached from leaning over sinks. And I went home every night smelling of grease. But I didn't care. For the first time in my life, my labor was mine. The coins I earned went into my pocket, not into Charles's whiskey. I rented a tiny room above the diner, barely bigger than a closet, with peeling wallpaper and a draft that whistled through the window. But when I lay down on that narrow bed, I smiled, because no one was shouting my name. No one was raising a hand to me. The silence was a gift. Still, there were nights when loneliness crept in. I would sit by the window staring out at the glowing city lights and think of Daniel. Did he miss me? Was he safe? Did Mama think of me when she laid her head down? Guilt weighed heavy on my heart, but I reminded myself I had left so I could live. One day, if I became strong enough, maybe I could help him too. Those early years in Chicago tested me. Money was always short, meals were small, and some days I wondered if I had made a mistake. But each morning when I tied my apron and walked into that diner, I stood a little taller. I was building something. Piece by piece, I was reclaiming the life Charles had tried to take from me. Working at the diner gave me food and a roof, but little else. The days bled together, scrubbing plates, sweeping floors, carrying crates that were too heavy for my thin arms. My fingertips were always raw, my shoulders always sore, and though I was free of Charles, some nights I felt just as trapped as before. I remember one particularly cold winter night. Snow whipped against the windows, the streets outside nearly empty. The diner was quiet, only a few regulars lingering over coffee. As I wiped down the counter, I wondered if this was all my life would ever be. Scrubbing, scraping, surviving. A heaviness settled in my chest, and for a moment, I thought about packing my bag and disappearing again. But where would I go? That's when Mr. Thompson walked in. He was a tall man, older, with kind eyes behind round spectacles. He was a school teacher, though I didn't know that yet. He came in often for pie and coffee, always polite, always with a book tucked under his arm. That night, as I set his cup down, he looked at me closely and said, "You've got sharp eyes, young lady. Do you like to read?" The question startled me. Most people saw me as nothing more than the girl with the rag in her hand. "I do," I said softly. "I used to read at the library back home." His eyes lit up. "Then you mustn't let that go. Books are doors. They'll take you farther than these walls ever could." I smiled faintly, but my heart ached. I don't have time for books anymore. He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Make time. Even 10 minutes a day. A mind like yours shouldn't be wasted." The next evening he came again, and this time he left a small worn paperback on the counter. "Pride and Prejudice. For you," he said. "Bring it back when you're done." That book changed me. I read it late at night in my little room, the street lamp casting just enough light to make out the words. Page by page, I remembered who I was. Not just a girl who scrubbed dishes, but a girl with thoughts, dreams, and possibilities. Mr. Thompson noticed the spark returning to my eyes. One night, he said gently, "You ever thought about going back to school?" I laughed bitterly. "School? I left home with nothing. I can't afford it." "Night classes are free at the community center," he said. "And you're not too old. It's never too late to learn." Those words dug into me deeper than any insult Charles had ever hurled. Never too late, so I went. At first, I was terrified. I walked into that classroom with my heart pounding, afraid I'd make a fool of myself. The other students were older too. Factory workers, single mothers, men who had left school to fight in the war. We all carried our own scars, but we also carried determination. I studied harder than I thought possible. Math, reading, writing, subjects that once felt dull, now glowed with meaning. Each lesson was another brick in the foundation of a new life. Mr. Thompson encouraged me every step of the way, reminding me that my mind was just as capable as anyone else's. I'll never forget the night I passed my final exam. The teacher handed me my certificate, and I held it in trembling hands. For the first time, I had proof that I wasn't worthless, proof that I could succeed. When I walked back into the diner the next morning, apron tied around my waist, the world looked different. The work hadn't changed, but I had. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building. When I held that little certificate in my hands, I felt taller somehow, as though the weight of Charles's cruel words had finally slipped from my shoulders. But a certificate doesn't pay rent, and life was still hard. I continued working long shifts at the diner, but little by little I saved up what I could. Pennies, nickels. The rare dollar bill slipped into my jar tucked beneath my mattress. Every coin was a piece of freedom. It took nearly a year before I had enough to take the next step. The apartment wasn't much. Just one room in an old brick building downtown, with a single window that looked out over the streetlight. The wallpaper peeled, the pipes rattled, and in winter the cold crept through the cracks. But it was mine alone. For the first time, I locked a door behind me at night and knew no one could barge in. I could breathe. The first night I lay on that narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, I felt both joy and sorrow pressing against my chest. Joy because I had carved out a space of my own. Sorrow because it was so empty. No family, no warmth, no laughter. Just me. But I whispered to myself, this is the beginning. The diner remained my steady anchor. But now that I was studying, I found opportunities I had never imagined. One of the regulars, a woman named Mrs. Hayes, worked as a secretary at the town's law office. She noticed my diligence and told me they needed someone to file paperwork in the evenings. The pay wasn't much, but it was better than tips, and it meant I could leave the diner behind. I remember walking into that office for the first time, the shelves stacked high with books, the clicking of typewriters, the smell of ink and paper. It felt like stepping into a world of importance, and though I started at the bottom, sorting files and running errands, I felt proud. My name was written on the payroll. My hours were steady. My dignity, piece by piece, was coming back to me. But the loneliness never left completely. Nights in that apartment stretched long and quiet. Sometimes I'd sit by the window, watching the couple strolling hand in hand on the sidewalk below, and wonder if I'd ever have a family of my own. Part of me was afraid that I was too damaged, that no one could love someone with my scars. Other nights, the silence was so heavy I'd bury myself in books just to keep from thinking about Charles's voice, still echoing in my mind. Then one evening, while carrying a stack of documents to the courthouse, I met James Carter. He was a young lawyer, new to town, with an easy smile and a way of listening that made you feel as though your words mattered. At first, I thought nothing of it. Men had never brought me anything but pain and disappointment. But James was different. He asked about my studies, about my work, about the books I read. He didn't treat me like the help. He treated me like a person. I was cautious. I kept my walls high. But he was patient. Each time our paths crossed, he chipped away at the fear inside me, showing me that kindness didn't always hide cruelty. One winter afternoon, he offered to walk me home. The snow was falling, the street lamps glowing, and for the first time in years, I laughed, truly laughed. The sound startled me. It had been so long since I'd heard it. It wasn't love at first sight, not the kind you read about in fairy tales. It was slower, gentler, built on trust. He never pushed, never pried. He simply showed up time and again, until I began to believe that maybe I wasn't destined to carry my burdens alone forever. Still, late at night, when the lights were out and the city was quiet, doubt crept in. Could I ever let someone close again? Could I risk being hurt, controlled, broken? The thought terrified me. But another voice, quieter, steadier, reminded me how far I had come. From Charles's house of cruelty to this little apartment of freedom, I had already rewritten part of my story. Maybe, just maybe, I could write more. James kept finding his way into my life, as if the world itself wanted me to see that good men still existed. He didn't overwhelm me with flowers or grand gestures. Instead, he offered something I had never truly known from a man: patience. He would stop by the diner even after I had left that job, just to share a cup of coffee with me during my lunch breaks at the law office. He'd walk me home when the evenings grew late, never asking to come inside, never demanding anything more than conversation. I fought against it at first. Every kindness he showed stirred up shadows of Charles, and I'd wait for the cruelty to follow. But it never came. Instead, James simply listened. He asked about my favorite books, about the dreams I hadn't dared to share with anyone else. One night I told him that, as a little girl, I used to write stories in a notebook, dreaming of being a teacher one day. My voice cracked when I admitted I thought those dreams had died long ago. He looked at me with such gentleness and said, "Dreams don't die, Evelyn. Sometimes they just wait until you're strong enough to chase them." That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling of my tiny apartment, his words echoing in my mind. Strong enough? Had I really become that? After everything I'd endured? Could I dare to believe I was strong now? Not weak? Over time, the walls I had built around my heart began to soften. He never rushed me, never pressed for more, and slowly I began to let him in. I'll never forget the night he took my hand for the first time. We were sitting on a park bench beneath the golden glow of a street lamp, the crisp air filling our lungs. My heart pounded, not with fear, but with something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. His hand was steady, warm, and safe. But with that hope came terror. The thought of marriage, of giving another man power over me, sent chills through me. So when James finally asked if I would consider building a life with him, my first response was silence. My mind swirled with every memory of Charles. The blows, the insults, the fear of never being enough. I couldn't speak, and I saw the flicker of hurt in James's eyes before he quickly masked it with patience. "I don't need an answer now," he said softly. "I just want you to know my heart is here when you're ready." Weeks passed before I found the courage to tell him my truth. We were walking along the river, the water glistening in the moonlight, when the words spilled out of me. My father's death, my mother's remarriage, Charles's cruelty, the nights of labor and pain. My voice trembled, but I forced myself to keep going. I wanted him to know the darkness I carried, to see if he would still want me once he knew the whole of me. When I finished, I couldn't look at him. I expected pity, or worse, distance, but instead he reached for my hand again and said, "Evelyn, what he did to you doesn't define you. You're the bravest person I've ever known, and if you'll let me, I'll spend my life proving that not all men are like him." I wept that night, not from pain, but from the sheer relief of being seen, truly seen, and not rejected. It took time, months of slow healing, of relearning what trust felt like. But eventually, I said yes. Not out of desperation, not out of fear of being alone, but because I wanted to. Because for the first time I believed I deserved happiness. Our wedding was small, a little church with creaking pews, a handful of friends, and Mrs. Hayes from the law office dabbing her eyes in the back row. I wore a simple white dress borrowed from a neighbor. James wore his best suit. There were no grand decorations, no lavish feasts, but when he slipped that ring onto my finger and whispered, "You're safe with me, always," it felt like a promise written into my very soul. That night, as I lay beside him in our first home together, a modest little house with chipped paint and creaky floors, I realized something I never thought I'd believe again. Love, real love, wasn't a cage. It was freedom. Becoming James's wife was the beginning of a life I had never dared to imagine. For the first time, I woke in the mornings without dread. The sound of footsteps in the hall no longer sent fear rushing through me. Instead, I woke to the smell of coffee, to James humming softly as he read the morning paper, to the sound of safety. Not long after our wedding, I found out I was expecting. I will never forget that day. My hands shook as I held the letter from the doctor's office, my eyes blurring with tears. I was terrified that I wouldn't be good enough, that I might somehow pass along the pain I carried, that I wouldn't know how to love properly after years of being starved of it. But when I told James, his face broke into the widest smile, and he pulled me into his arms, whispering, "This child will know nothing but love, Evelyn, nothing but love." 9 months later, I held my daughter in my arms. We named her Sarah Grace, after my grandmother, who had always been gentle and kind. She was tiny, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that seemed too wise for a newborn. The moment I touched her, something inside me broke and healed all at once. The years of cruelty, the words that had scarred me, the loneliness of my youth. They all seemed to lose their power in that moment. I had created life. I had given this little soul a chance to know the world. And I swore, with everything in me, that she would never know the pain I had endured. Motherhood wasn't easy. The nights were long, the money was tight, and sometimes exhaustion left me in tears at the kitchen table. But even in the hardest moments, I never forgot that I was building something better than what I had known. When Sarah cried in the night, I held her close and whispered promises into her tiny ears. When she laughed for the first time, I laughed too, and it felt like sunshine pouring into a house that had once been filled only with shadows. 2 years later, we welcomed a son, Michael James. He was loud and full of energy from the moment he entered the world. While Sarah was quiet and thoughtful, Michael had a fire in him that reminded me of my own stubborn spirit. Watching the two of them grow, side by side, filled my heart in ways I cannot put into words. Still, my past haunted me. Some nights, when the children were asleep and the house was quiet, I would wake in a cold sweat, Charles's voice echoing in my mind. I'd see his shadow in the corners of the room, hear the sting of his belt, feel the weight of his words. I would lie there trembling, afraid the nightmares would spill into my waking life. But James was always there. He never shamed me for the tears I couldn't explain. He would hold me until my breathing steadied, whispering, "You're safe, Evelyn. He's gone. He can't hurt you anymore." Slowly, with each passing year, the memories lost their sharpness. They never disappeared, but they became something different. Less of a wound, more of a scar. Something I carried, but something that no longer controlled me. Raising Sarah and Michael became my mission. I poured everything into giving them the childhood I never had. We read books together by the fire, went on long walks in the park, baked cookies on rainy afternoons. I wanted them to grow up knowing that home was a place of warmth, not fear. That parents could be protectors, not tormentors. One day, when Sarah was about 8 years old, she looked up at me while we were baking and asked, "Mama, were you always this happy?" The question struck me like lightning. For a moment, I froze, my hands covered in flour, my heart pounding with memories of the girl I had once been. The girl who cried herself to sleep on a cold bed in Charles's house. I smiled and kissed her forehead. "No, sweetheart. I wasn't always this happy, but happiness is something you can find, even after hard times. And I found mine when I had you." Tears stung my eyes, but I didn't let her see them. In that moment, I realized that everything I had endured had led me here, to this kitchen, with this child, with laughter bubbling between us. The pain of the past hadn't been for nothing. It had shaped me into the mother I had become, and in giving my children a life of love, I was healing the little girl I once was. The years with Sarah and Michael were some of the sweetest of my life, but they were not without hardship. Love filled our home, yes, but love doesn't shield you from life's storms. James worked tirelessly at the law office, often staying late into the evenings. I took in sewing on the side to help make ends meet. We were never wealthy, but we managed. Some days were leaner than others, yet I always found a way to stretch a pot of stew or mend clothes so they lasted another season. I told myself that as long as the children were fed and warm, we were rich enough. Then came the year the mill closed. Half the town lost their jobs overnight. Though James kept his position, many of our friends and neighbors weren't so lucky. I watched proud men line up outside the church for bread, women selling what little they owned just to buy shoes for their children. It broke my heart, and though we had little ourselves, I often found ways to share. A basket of biscuits, a warm blanket, a kind word. I remembered too well what it felt like to have nothing. But just as the town began to recover, a greater blow struck us. James fell ill. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a stubborn cough, the kind you catch in winter. But the cough grew worse, stealing his strength. The doctor used words I barely understood, long medical terms that all meant the same thing. My husband, my anchor was fading. I tried to stay strong for the children, but every night when they went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table, my hands trembling around a cold cup of tea. Fear gripped me. How could I raise Sarah and Michael alone? How could I protect them from a world that had already taken so much from me? James, even as he grew weaker, never stopped comforting me. You've survived worse, Evelyn. He whispered one night, his voice hoarse. You're the strongest woman I know. No matter what happens, I know you'll carry on. I wanted to scream at him not to speak like that, not to leave me. But deep down, I knew he was right. I had survived cruelty, loneliness, and despair. I had rebuilt myself from nothing. If the unthinkable happened, I would find a way again. When he passed, the house felt unbearably quiet. The children cried themselves to sleep for weeks, and I cried silently in the dark so they wouldn't hear. I felt as though the foundation beneath me had crumbled. The world seemed cruel again, threatening to drag me back into the darkness I had fought so hard to escape. But I couldn't let it. I had two little souls looking up at me, depending on me. I knew the dangers of surrendering to despair, so I did the only thing I could. I got up each day, dressed myself, and kept going. I worked longer hours. I tightened every corner of our budget, and I poured every bit of love I had into Sarah and Michael. There were nights when I wanted to give up, when exhaustion made me collapse into bed without supper. But then Sarah would slip her tiny hand into mine, or Michael would bring me a picture he'd drawn of our family, and I knew I couldn't fail them. One Sunday after church, the pastor asked me how I kept smiling despite everything. I looked at my children, chasing each other in the grass, their laughter ringing through the air, and I said because they deserve to see joy, not sorrow, and I'll give them that, no matter how heavy my heart is. That was the moment I realized my strength was no longer just about survival. It was about legacy. My children would grow up remembering a mother who stood tall, even when life tried to break her. And in that strength, maybe they would find their own. Time has a way of moving forward, even when your heart wants to stay in the past. After James passed, I thought the world had ended, but the days kept coming. The sun rose each morning, whether I wanted it to or not. And with every sunrise, Sarah and Michael grew a little taller, a little stronger. Sarah was always the thoughtful one, quiet but determined. She loved books as much as I once did, and I saw in her the same hunger for knowledge that Mr. Thompson once sparked in me. I encouraged her at every turn, even when money was tight, even when it meant working an extra shift to buy her a set of used textbooks. I told her, your education is your ticket to a life no one can take from you. Michael, on the other hand, was fire and energy, a boy who never could sit still. He was charming, funny, the kind who could light up a room with his grin. But that fire sometimes burned out of control. As a teenager, he started running with boys who found trouble faster than they found work. More than once I lay awake at night, waiting to hear his footsteps on the porch, praying he wouldn't end up in jail, or worse. One night I heard a knock on the door, and my heart nearly stopped. But it wasn't the police. It was Michael himself standing there with bruised knuckles and eyes full of shame. I messed up, Mama, he whispered. My instinct was to scold him, to demand answers. But when I saw him trembling like a lost little boy, I pulled him into my arms instead. You can fix this, I told him. But you've got to choose a different path. Don't waste the chances I fought for you to have. Those years were hard. Sarah buried herself in her studies, and Michael teetered on the edge between failure and redemption. I worked harder than ever, sometimes juggling 2 jobs just to keep the house warm and the pantry stocked. There were moments I thought I couldn't go on, that maybe life had taken too much from me already. But every time I looked at my children, I remembered why I kept fighting. The day Sarah graduated high school, I thought my heart would burst. She walked across that stage in a second-hand dress, holding her diploma with tears shining in her eyes. I clapped until my hands ached. In that moment, I saw not just her future, but mine too. The proof that all the suffering, all the sacrifice, had built something beautiful. Michael's journey took longer. There were setbacks, more nights of worry, more prayers whispered into the dark. But slowly he began to change. He started helping a neighbor with carpentry, discovered he had a knack for building things with his hands. For the first time, I saw pride in his eyes. Not the pride of mischief, but of honest work. Watching my children grow was bittersweet. They no longer needed me the way they once had. Sarah talked of college in another state. Michael spoke of apprenticeships that might take him far from home. My heart ached at the thought of them leaving, but I knew this was what I had fought for. Their chance to build lives bigger than the one I had been given. One evening, as we sat together at the kitchen table, Sarah reached for my hand and said, "Mama, I don't know how you did it. You lost so much, but you never gave up on us." Her words brought tears to my eyes. For years I had carried the weight of doubt, wondering if I was enough, if I had given them the life they deserved. Hearing her say that was like balm on an old wound. I realized then that strength isn't about never breaking. It's about breaking and choosing to stand again anyway. And that was the lesson I wanted my children to carry forward. The house grew quieter as Sarah and Michael spread their wings. Sarah went away to college, the first in our family to ever do so. I remember standing at the bus station, waving until the back of her head disappeared from view. My heart ached with pride and sorrow all at once. Michael, too, found his way. He apprenticed with a carpenter in town, and for the first time I saw him come home each night with dirt on his hands and satisfaction in his smile. I filled the silence with work, church and neighbors who had become more like family. Yet the quiet was sometimes deafening. I had spent so many years pushing forward for the sake of my children that when they no longer needed me as much, I had to rediscover who I was. It was in those years that I learned the beauty of small joys. I planted flowers by the window, baked bread not just out of necessity but because the smell comforted me. I read again, book after book, as though reclaiming the part of myself Charles had once tried to strip away. And I began to write, scribbling stories and memories in old notebooks, pouring out the words I had carried inside for decades. Then came the day Sarah introduced me to the man she planned to marry. His name was David, a kind-eyed teacher who reminded me in many ways of James. I saw the way he looked at her, the way her laughter came easy in his presence, and I knew my little girl had found the same gift I once had, the gift of true love. Their wedding was larger than mine had been, full of music and dancing, but the moment that struck me most was when Sarah turned to me, tears in her eyes, and said, "Mama, you taught me what love really means." Not long after, she gave me the greatest gift of all, a granddaughter. The first time I held that tiny bundle in my arms, I thought my heart might burst. Her name was Emily, and when her little fingers curled around mine, I felt a circle close. All the pain of my youth, all the nights of fear, all the years of struggle, they had led me here, to this moment, with life beginning anew in my arms. Michael, too, found his path. He married a strong, steady woman named Caroline, and together they built a home full of laughter and warmth. When he placed his first son in my lap, tears ran down my cheeks. I remembered the boy who had once stood at my door with bruised knuckles and shame in his eyes. And now here he was, a man, a father, carrying his family forward with strength. Being a grandmother was different from being a mother. With my own children, I had carried the heavy weight of responsibility. With my grandchildren, I could simply savor. I told them stories, baked them cookies, kissed scraped knees, and whispered to them the same promises I had once whispered to Sarah and Michael. You are loved. You are safe. You are enough. One evening, as little Emily sat curled against me on the porch swing, she asked, "Grandma, were you ever afraid when you were a girl?" Her question pierced straight to my heart. For a moment, the memories threatened to choke me. The belt, the cruel words, the loneliness. But then I looked into her innocent eyes and realized I had a choice. I could pass down the fear, or I could pass down the strength. I smiled and brushed her hair back. Yes, sweetheart, I was afraid. But I learned something very important. Even when the world is dark, you can carry your own light. And as long as you hold on to it, no one can ever take it away from you. As the years went on, my home filled again. Not with the cries of my own babies, but with the laughter of grandchildren. Holidays were noisy, chaotic, full of spilled drinks and scattered toys. And I wouldn't have traded a single moment. Every smile, every hug, every whispered, "I love you." Grandma was proof that I had broken the chain of pain that once bound me. I often think of Charles in those quiet hours when the children have gone home and the house is still. I don't think of him with bitterness anymore. He was a storm, yes, but storms pass. What matters is what grows after them. And looking around at my family, at the love and joy that fill my days, I know he didn't win. I reclaimed my dignity. I built a legacy of love. And when I leave this world, I want my children and grandchildren to remember not the woman who suffered, but the woman who rose. The years have been kind in ways I never expected. Wrinkles mark my face now, but each line is a story of survival, of sacrifice, of love reclaimed. My hands are worn, but they are the hands that built a life from the ruins of cruelty. Sometimes I sit by the window at dusk, watching the sun slip behind the hills. The quiet feels different now. It no longer echoes with loneliness, but with peace. I hear the voices of my grandchildren in the distance, their laughter spilling through the open door, and I know this is the life I fought for. I think back to that frightened girl who once cried herself to sleep under the shadow of a cruel stepfather. She thought she would never escape, never know freedom, never feel loved. If I could reach back through time, I would take her hand and whisper, "Hold on. The pain will not last forever. One day you will build something beautiful from the ashes." Because I did. I built love out of loss. I built joy out of sorrow. I built a family where kindness, not fear, is the foundation. That is my victory. I don't know how many days I have left, but I know this. When I leave, I will not leave behind bitterness. I will leave behind a legacy of resilience, of dignity, of love that could not be broken. My story is not just about what I endured. It's about how I rose. And if anyone hears my story, I want them to remember this. You are stronger than the darkness. No cruelty can define you. No storm can wash away the light inside you. Carry it, protect it, and one day, it will guide you home. As the evening light fades and my family gathers around me, I close my eyes and smile. For the first time in a long time, I feel whole. I am Evelyn. I was broken, but I rose again. And in the end, I won.